Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back to Sure Babe. This is your host, Chrissy Powers. Today I'm beyond thrilled, but I'm also just honored, and I feel almost like this is a full circle moment for me to be able to interview Michaela Boehm. She is a teacher and a counselor who counsels and teaches internationally as an expert in intimacy and sexuality. But she is also the creator of Nonlinear Movement, which is the somatic therapy that I just got trained in order to help others release trauma from their bodies and become more fully alive and embodied in their bodies. So I'm excited today to share a little bit more of exactly what that is and how it can help you, especially in these unprecedented times. Michaela was born and raised in Austria. She combines degrees in psychology and extensive clinical experience with her in-depth training in the yogic arts as a classical Kashmiri Tantric lineage holder. Her approach empowers others through an eclectic mix of education, experiential exercises, and guided explorations. She's known for her work with high-performing individuals, and her ongoing private clients include Oscar winners, actors, producers, business pioneers, and multiple Grammy-winning musicians. She is the real deal when I say that. She lives on an organic farm in California where she rescues and rehabilitates animals, and I got to visit that farm in January and take her Nonlinear Movement training course. So you might have seen Michaela on Goop. She's been Gwyneth Paltrow's counselor, and she was on her Goop Instagram talking about intimacy during quarantine, and she was also on Jada Pinkett Smith's The Red Table talking about the same topic. So she's a wealth of knowledge, and she has brought what she's learned about trauma and release and the body's wisdom forth in the world, and I'm so honored to be able to be trained under her. So that's a bit of good news for me. But in this episode, you're going to hear my personal story of trauma and how I got on this path of wanting to learn how to remove it from my body, because I was just at a place where I was so tired of living like the other shoe was going to fall. And I know a lot of you out there right now are feeling that. So I feel like this episode is timely and it's good for everybody to listen to. And I really hope that it impacts you and that you'll want to try nonlinear movement with me. So without further ado, let's get into the episode with Michaela Boehm. All right, welcome to the show, Sure Babe, Michaela Boehm. I'm so excited to have her here. She has been my teacher for the last few months in nonlinear movement, and it's just an honor to have her on the show. So welcome.
Thank you.
So I wanted to start with a quote that I read in your book, The Wild Woman's Way, which everyone should pick up and read right now. And it's on your journey. And in the beginning, you say, each of us has that native embodied wisdom, a wild, untamed, undomesticated body, mind, and heart that knows what is true for us. I just loved that because I feel like for a long time I didn't know my body's wisdom. So could you expand on that and talk a little bit about that a little bit more?
Hmm. Yeah, there's so many ways to go to that, but the I think simplest way is to say that our body has kept us alive for millions of years. And what I mean by that is before we had, massive brain function, the body already knew how to live, right? And how to work and how to flee from a danger and how to feed ourselves and all of those, functions. And within that, of course, also in embodied wisdom is intuition and how the nervous system works and how we regulate stress and how we find mates and all of those things sit very squarely in the body, and they are functions that have been developed to be optimal. And our, big brains doing the things our big brains do is a fairly new development as far as humans go. And it's not to say that the brain and having good cognitive function isn't important, it's just not all there is. And when we avail ourselves of the intelligence of the body, because the body knows how to release stress, the body knows how to give birth, the body knows how to ovulate, the body knows how to breathe, right? We don't actually know that consciously. We sometimes mess with it by having all kinds of ideas on how we should breathe or do things. But if we just relax into the native intelligence of the body, a lot of the things that are already in place can be done better, and we can function a lot more holistically and fully. So that's a quick way of saying we have innate wisdom. There's, of course, also, right, the innate wisdom that comes from kind of the joint human development and consciousness that's more in the mythical, um, collective unconscious way. That's also there.
Mm-hmm.
But first comes feeling the body, being with the body, using the body's abilities the best we can.
Okay. I love the term embodiment, which for me is it kind of was a new word in the last year, which is so funny to me, learning through your practices like what true embodiment is. I had no clue, and I had no clue that my body actually had wisdom in it. I was trained as a marriage and family therapist, and most of that training is all up in the mind, and so I would love for you to talk a little bit more about the embodied lifestyle, and really let's talk about what embodiment is, because I think people throw around that word and we don't really know what that means. So, how would you talk about or explain to someone what true embodiment is?
Mm. Well, different people have different ideas about that, of course. It's one of those words that's become very potent and also very popular. So, the way I describe it in the book and in general when we teach is essentially an ability to listen to the body and to take the body into account. And so, one of the most important things to know is that we're always in our body, right? As long as we're alive, we're always in our body, of course. But within that, there is functions that make us not aware or numb to the signals of the body, and functions that make us very aware to the signals of the body. The body always sends messages, right? Messages of comfort and discomfort, messages of stress or relaxation. The body lets us know when we're hungry or tired, or when we have stomach issues or something like that. It's just how much can we listen? The more noise there is, mental noise, external noise from stress, trauma, right? Things that have shut us down to hearing what the body says because that was very traumatic at some point. All of those things make it so we are numb to the messages of the body. The body always sends messages, we just can't hear them. So when we are embodied, what that means is essentially that we can listen to the messages of the body and then further act on them accordingly and appropriately.
Mm. So, for just for the sake of explaining that more, I'm going to share a little personal story of how I got into um, this work and trauma, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the trauma and then how nonlinear movement can help. I believe that I became traumatized in motherhood, which is a funny thing to say because I think that our culture holds motherhood up to be this phase of life that is just supposed to be glamorized and wonderful and full of love. So as I became a mom, I just remember bringing home my newborn and kind of looking at him next to me, and I freaked out. I just thought, how in the world am I supposed to keep this human alive? So immediately from his birth, I was kind of traumatized. And then around um, right before he turned 2, an event happened. I was hanging out at my parents' church after the service, and I had a very active toddler, and he ran away from me, and I was running after him, and I turned this corner right after him, and then it was like he was gone. I had no idea where he went. And so I started to look for him, and I couldn't find him. A couple minutes went by, and I thought, went out to this parking lot, couldn't find him. And then I started to panic. I went into this panic mode, and people started helping. So then you get this, like, whole, oh, wow, everybody's looking for my son and we can't find him feeling. And we were visiting. So, no one really knew him that well. And he was, just this little toddler. And so then this woman went out to the very front by the street, which I was paralyzed already. So learning through your program of immobilization, I was already in immobilization. And this woman came back after she had asked the people in the front if they'd seen this little boy. And she was hysterical. And she said, those boys saw a man pick him up and take him. And in that moment, my legs fell out beneath me. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to throw up. Um, it was probably the worst moment of my life. And it was about I think I can't even remember how long it was, but probably a couple minutes later, they had found him. Someone had seen his little toes behind this door. He had turned that first corner and gone into this copy room and closed the door, and it locked behind him. And so the whole time he was in this copy room, and I was going through this, like, I had lived for at least 2 minutes thinking my son was kidnapped. And so, police were called. Um, and then after we found him, I literally couldn't stand. I crawled to him. I, I changed as a person that day. I say that, like, on a cellular level, I changed. And I didn't know that I needed help for a long time. It was 2 years after that I was just incapable of functioning at the level that I was wanting to function at, let alone just thrive. Um, and I know I needed help. So that started me on the journey of getting help. And then I would say it was probably 4 years after that I found nonlinear movement. But that was my experience of trauma. And for a long time, I never labeled it as trauma because the end result was I got my son back. That's not a real trauma. But what I've learned from reading the books that you've recommended and things like that, that what your body goes through, you called it the shit that happens to you is trauma. So can you talk a little bit about that, what you view as trauma and how we as women, our bodies, uh, go through it?
Yeah, well, I first want to say that absolutely, right? Absolutely. Um, what you experienced there would be considered traumatic, right? Um,
Yes,
you know, absolutely. It doesn't matter how it ends. Just because you don't die in a car accident doesn't mean it wasn't traumatic, right?
exactly.
So,
Yeah.
that I think that's the important thing to say first. Now, when we look at it in a bigger picture, right, there is the very clinical descriptions of trauma and traumatic response, but there's also a bit of a wider view you can take when you engage with the somatics, meaning how body and mind and emotion play together. So
Hmm.
we can assume um, let me make this super easy, right? When there is an event that disturbs your nervous system that has a residue that could be considered a body trauma or an injury. So that it could be emotional, could be mental, it could be physical. It's usually a combination thereof. So a good way to describe this for ease sake is that we'll use your example there with the um, with the incident. your entire body went into fight or flight, right? Um, then it went immediately into freeze. And so I'll talk a
Yeah.
little bit about that. Fight or flight, of course, is fairly easy to spot because you're either ready to take somebody's head off, or lift a car off your baby, or break a door down, or all of those kind of things, or you're running away as fast as you can, which is an appropriate result if you're being attacked or chased or things like that. Freeze is another trauma response, which essentially makes you hunker down in place. And you can
Mm.
easily see how, in the early days of humankind, these were really important functions, right? You were stalked by a saber-tooth cat, right? You would either try to fight it if you had to, run as fast as you can, or if you weren't in the immediate vicinity, hunker down somewhere in the bushes and wait things out, right? So those are valuable tools. The
Yeah.
thing with those tools is that they kind of cut out the executive thinking function because they're instinctive. It's actually not useful to be able to have full thinking capacity when you have to react instinctively. Because if you go, I wonder if I should fight that cat or run or hide, you're dead already, right? So
Mm.
so your rational thinking goes out the window. I'm saying this as just as an extra because in your situation, you could tell that from what you just said, right? You couldn't think clearly.
Yeah.
You
I couldn't.
couldn't run out and look and open doors and do things, right? You get completely paralyzed when you were told that somebody had taken your child, right? And even before that,
Yeah. And for years, I felt guilty over the fact that I couldn't do what you just said, open doors and
right?
look. I stopped and I fell
Yeah, well,
down and I
that can
couldn't
happen.
breathe.
That's a fairly natural response, particularly considering what we know about human development, because freeze is more common in women than in men. Because
Mm.
when you look at how things used to be, right, there were invading whatever tribes, the women and children would duck in the tall grass and be as
Yeah.
immobilized as possible till the danger passed. So it's a logical response. It's not logical in our time and age and when you have to function, right? But it's a logical response to some very frightening situation. And so I'm saying all of this to say that when those things happen, there's a chain reaction of events in the body, everything from adrenaline being poured, into your system so you can run faster and fight harder and breathe more so you get more oxygen to the cells that need it, and you get tunnel vision and tingling in arms and feet from the extra kind of push given the metallic taste in the mouth, all those things that say you are now in fight or flight. And in freeze, though, it goes the exact opposite. The heartbeat actually slows down and you become somewhat immobilized, which is an interesting thing when people go to the emergency room in a moment of extreme trauma. But that's a side story. The main thing is when that happens, the body alters its behavior and its chemistry. And in an ideal world, you then act however you need to act. And when it's done, your body releases the entire situation. So when you see it in nature, you see animals after they've been chased and not eaten, right? They stand somewhere and they shake and they shake and they shake. And then at some point they shake themselves off and then they just go back to grazing or whatever they were doing. Human beings have somewhat lost the ability to do that because we have to then have further action, right? So you had to take care of your child, you had to talk with other people, you had to deal with the other fallout, you probably had your parents there, so you had to kind of pull yourself together. And that pulling yourself together, voluntarily or involuntarily, seals some of these reactions and behaviors and emotional um, situations into the body. also into the mind. Like you said, you felt guilty. You've never quite felt the same about leaving him anywhere, probably, right? Because we're, of
Right.
course, thinking humans, and so we can make things mean something. And then it ties in with other emotional stuff we have. And suddenly we have a entire conglomerate of physical, emotional, and mental behaviors around that injury, around that trauma.
Mm.
And that now becomes a kind of a set of circumstances on its own that can be triggered. And so, he walks around the corner, you get a bit triggered, right? And that entire, and that entire experience loads back up in your nervous system.
Yes.
Or if something happens relationally, often this happens, we get left behind or betrayed or whatever, and it's not trauma in the classic sense, but it's very traumatic and very heartbreaking, and we kind of armor ourselves, we protect ourselves from that ever happening again. How do we do that? We shut a bit of feeling off, right? We just don't allow ourselves to open that much or go in that deeply, or allow for touch to affect us that deeply, because we're now armored, we're defended, right?
Mm.
So all of
Right.
that could be considered trauma in the body or injury in the body, right? And when we have those patterns start restricting the way we can be in the world with our, partners and parents and children and business, depending on what it is. And you can go to therapy, as you well know, being trained as one, and talk about it, but that really doesn't release it from the body, because in the body it's patterns of behavior, it's patterns of contraction, it's uploading as the experience, with all the physiological signs. And so when we look
Mm.
at somatics, somatic therapies, and somatic release and things like that, what we're looking at is loosening the behavioral and habitual holds and closures and clenches and defenses out of the body, and creating new pathways that are not as hindered by that particular incident.
I'm so glad that you said that because yes, I love therapy and I love my therapist, but I kept feeling a block when we did EMDR. I feel like there's a lot of benefit to EMDR, but for some reason, my subconscious would just only go so far. And so when I was introduced to nonlinear movement, there was just something about it for me that interested me. And then when I started to do it, it was so powerful and more things. And this is very, true that my therapist said. She said, Chrissy, your anxiety, because as you can imagine, after that traumatic event, I became an anxious person,
Mhm.
which I had never been before. And she said, I believe your anxiety has started before the traumatic event. And that was something new in my mind. I just thought that was the start of it. So doing nonlinear opened up so much more than just that traumatic event.
Mhm.
I found through movements that I felt I was suppressing things as a woman that as a little girl were shut off because of my environment or because of my religious beliefs or because of my family or my relationship with my father. And so I want to talk now about nonlinear movement because you are the creator of this powerful somatic therapy. So can you explain how this started for you? How did you start this movement, start this therapy, and realize, wow, this is so powerful. This really affects me as a person and it can help
Hmm.
others.
Well, it started as something completely different, which was a kind of inner channel practice that I did within some of my yogic trainings, yogic tantric training. And in that particular practice, you kind of, feel the channels in the body, and it's a very subtle engagement with your kind of inner energy lines. And one of the ways that when I did that, one of the things that I noticed was that I had areas of tightness and tension in my body. And I realized that when I would relax those areas, and in the yogic systems, they talk about channels, which you can almost imagine like hoses that are kinked or open, right? So when I did that, I noticed that if I moved my spine and moved my body in certain ways that were very non yogic, in the sense that they were not asana based, meaning non posture yoga based, right? So they were very undulating, sometimes sharp, sometimes soft, very subtle internal and external motions that released some of the tension and strain. And so I started playing with that. And then I had a series of events that I don't want to necessarily go into, but that had to do with a few of my, well, two of my closest friends, or I should actually say my two closest friends died within a year apart in my early 20s. And I had a very hard time with that. Actually, the woman closest to me, who was kind of my sister, we were a year apart, died within 6 months of very, very aggressive breast cancer. And I couldn't really deal with that. And it caused a very deep inquiry into death and, illness, and uh, the not being able to cope or feel certain things. And I noticed that that particular practice really made a difference. And so I kind of used it for myself for many years as a means to work with trauma and traumatic events and things that I wanted to get out of my body. And then as I started, um, you know, my, doing counseling sessions myself and working with people, there was a period of time where I did see 9 people a day, 5 days a week, and which is very, it's very demanding. And so
Yeah.
I would be very tired and very kind of, affected by things. And I started doing that particular movement on my hands and knees in my bed, because that's what felt the best. And that's how I realized that there was an incredible benefit to that posture, because it could actually access the entire body, right? You could move your spine, your hips, your thighs, the belly, the organs, the neck, the shoulders, right? All of that could be moved. And so that's when I really started developing nonlinear movement. And that was in the early mid 90s, I'd say. I had done it just for myself before then, and then it became kind of something that I started teaching clients. And then I saw clients and treated people in a rehab situation where people were mostly dual diagnosis and had some really, really severe sexual or physical trauma, sometimes generational, it's very, very bad stuff. And so I started teaching it in groups and also individually to my, people, as a means to be able to deal with those strong emotions that would come up once they were no longer doing drugs to suppress them. And it went from there. I used it very, very effectively in the rehab. I used it with people who were extremely abused physically, emotionally. I've worked with people who've been through civil wars, um, and things of that nature, as a means to really unlodge things from the body without having to actually rehash these situations, which can
Mm-hmm.
be, very re-triggering and also not very useful, because it doesn't really release it from the body, effectively. So that's kind of how it came about. And then when Steve and I started teaching together in the, in the broader sense of traveling, through continents, we really developed it as something that could be taught, you are now certified to teach nonlinear yourself, right? And so,
Yes.
and there's people all over the world teaching it to all different kinds of groups of people, and it's very, very useful. And the important thing about nonlinear that I'm very adamant and also very excited about is that it's very non-force and non-imposition. So we don't force people to experience anything. We don't guide them or lead them into um, any area of inquiry. We're really just giving them the tool for the body to do what is best. And because of that, it can't stir things up that are not ready to be released. And it's extremely gentle and self guided, and allows people to empower themselves in their own trauma healing process. And it's not only for trauma, it's of course also, to kind of become more sensitized to our body in the realms of experience and boundary setting and pleasure and creativity. There's many modalities within nonlinear. The trauma one is just an important one because we often don't realize how much stuff is stuck in us.
I'm glad you said that because I love that about nonlinear, that the body is the genius, and you say all the time, you don't mess with the body. Don't tell someone what to release. They will know. And I love that because it's giving our bodies the permission to do what they want to do and to give it a voice. And so, and also the different modalities are just beautiful. Pleasure practice and calling in are some of my favorite things to do, to open up new pathways for
Mhm.
creativity and appreciate my body. I can remember at your ranch, back in January, having just one of the most precious pleasure practices, which, if anybody's listening and they're thinking, what is that? I love how you say that it's a coming alive exercise. I remember touching my hair and just thinking of how I was a little girl, and I loved, having my mom touch my hair, and how I was actually giving that love back to myself now as a 38-year-old woman who is in very much go, go, go mode all the time. And it was precious. And so I
Mhm.
love giving people the space to do that. And I think nonlinear is an amazing exercise and method, especially now, um, to utilize. So thank you for teaching it to me. um, how would you
Mm.
say right now, especially for women, nonlinear could help them in these unprecedented times?
Well, I think when we consider what we're working with right now, which is absolute uncertainty on all levels, right? On many levels, because we don't know what's going to happen and if something's going to happen, and any of those kind of things. Um, the, the the access to our body and to our intelligence that's I don't know exactly how to say that, that can deal with uncertainty, right? And that can release stress and that can create well being is very important. It's very, very important because essentially we don't know, right? We don't have any idea. And the, the nonlinear movement releases that kind of extreme stress. It also allows us to be um, resilient, right? And have the kind of strength to meet things because we don't have excess resistance or excess hold in the body. And that's really, really important.
I think you're right in that because yeah, I've been walking some women through it online, Zoom classes, and we've been talking about our
Yeah.
experience in quarantine, and how just different movements and doing the nonlinear has opened up like avenues of conversation, but also things that each woman didn't know was there. And I think in this time, it's giving us
Yeah.
you know, the red flag almost to say, hey, you have to pay attention to your body now. You have to take care of yourself at this time because it is so
Yeah.
unprecedented and unknown. So,
Yeah. Yeah, and things that used to be no big deal, right, are now a big deal.
yes.
And that's the important thing, is that we're essentially having to look at, um, you know, normal situations, and they're extremely abnormal. Just, going to the grocery store is really, really stressful for most people.
Hmm.
And so suddenly we have to be much more in tune with when our body has issues or when we need extra rest.
Mm.
It's very important.
Well, Michaela, thank you so much for your time. I just want to close with one more question. I wanted to know, what is the most important teaching you've received?
Oh. uh, I would say probably the most important teaching that I've received is that resistance is futile.
Yes.
And what I mean by that is that if the things we can't control, right, if we resist them, it just creates an enormous amount of suffering. That's not to say that we shouldn't control the things we can, right? But there's also something to be said about the fact that there's just areas like sickness and death and you know, natural disasters and losing our loved ones that we can't control, and um, bracing against that and constantly resisting that takes the joy in life away.
Mm,
And so in this particular time, right, where we have to look at, not knowing what's going to happen, I think it's really important to go with the unknown and do the best with what we have in this particular moment, so we can in fact enjoy the time and not just sit here and wait for this to end, because I don't know if it will. No one knows, right? So
right.
I think that's the thing that I had to learn the hard way, and that was very, very useful.
Yes, I can definitely identify with that. Well, thank you so much for being here. This was a joy for me to be able to talk to you. So, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that that helped enlighten you a little bit about maybe how you could have some hidden trauma that you didn't know about, or some way of thinking that maybe I need to do a nonlinear class or learn a little bit more about this amazing tool that can help me get through this time. If you're curious at all, please send me an email at chrissypowersmft@gmail.com. That's CHRISSYPOWERS MFT@gmail.com. I would love to schedule an appointment with you if you're interested in a nonlinear session. I'm also going to be offering classes. I have one tomorrow at 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. So if you're interested in that, you can email me and I will get you registered for that class. But be on the lookout, because I'm having a whole program launching in about a week. So I'm excited for that, and I'm just excited to be able to walk you guys through a practice that has changed my life and helped me come back to my most true, authentic self. So I am sending you guys so much grace and peace to you right now in this moment. Thanks so much for being here.